Perfect. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you everybody for coming and joining in this webinar. My name's Becky and I'm from Castle Race Series, and obviously there's Philip here from Try Training Harder. So we're just going to take you through a presentation all about the female athlete and the challenges and obstacles to training and racing, and a bit of information about this. Here at Castle Race Series, we strive to make racing inclusive and to close that gender gap from our competitors. And we've made many pathways to make racing more accessible for women, some of which I'll go into shortly. And if you have any questions at any time, just like jump on or pop your question in the comments and I can read those out. So here are some graphs we've got of gender by age group, and that's within competitors at our races. So it's grown a lot since we started out in 2009, but there is still a long way to go. So this has risen, as you can see, from 29% in 2009 to 38.3% in 2023. And British triathlon membership is the gender split has risen to 31.8. So we're proud that female participation is above the industry average, and we do recognise that there's a long way to go and a lot of hard work to make these events inclusive, but we are passionate that there is a race for all age, gender, ability. And we've worked with organisations such as This Girl Can and also Fund Her Try UK. And among younger age groups, the gap between male and female participation is smaller, but this gap increases with age. So from the graphs, the gap between female and male participation is narrowing, and this is among the younger age groups. So at the older age groups, unfortunately, this gap still persists, and this is where we're trying to mitigate those barriers to sort of participation for women in sport. And in looking at our return rate, this is over 40%. So a lot of people that come and race with us year after year are well attended, novices and elite athletes. And this just proves that there is an environment where athletes, regardless of experience, are valued and are celebrated among our events. And another thing that we do for at all of our races is we offer a women-only sprint wave. So this is for women that don't necessarily want to compete in a mixed field, which we know can be overwhelming. So it gives you a chance to participate solely with other female athletes, which we find just helps those feel more comfortable racing. And another sort of way that we've seen helps women sort of more women come to compete with us is involving a stepping stone into the sport. So we offer the starter triathlon, which is accessible and fun and rewarding, and it can be as a relay as well. So I think Philip will go into this, but it just is a better use to manage your time. If time is a limitation to your participation, it's a way that you can get involved in the sport, and you can start your triathlon journey. So the introduction as well to our run and swim series has opened a lot of doors for female participants. So it's popular because I think that with time pressures as well, you can focus on one discipline. So this, we found does help as well those people coming to compete with us sort of from, all aspects, whether you have time to train, like if you're novice and not elite. Yeah, it's sort of a great way to get involved in the sport. And that's kind of what we're about. We just want to get as many people in the sport as possible because triathlon is such a great sport. So that's some from me and some data that we've found. And a lot of that will be explored with Philip. So I will pass over to him, and any questions, just jump in.
Thanks, Becky.
Okay.
Excellent. So I want to really talk about kind of kick things off with starting and questioning kind of what exactly is the female athlete. So we see a lot of stuff out there around the female athlete, and it can quite often be marketing focused. But if you actually think about what the female athlete is, there isn't one. You look across the age range of an athlete, and there are several stages that a woman will go through throughout their athletic lifestyle. And there are implications along the way at each of those steps. I mean, there's only just started being some normalization, if you like, around talking about the menstrual cycle and the implications around that, which is starting some good conversations. But perimenopause or menopausal, postmenopausal athletes are kind of starting to get a look in, but that's not really discussed. There's very, very little data around pregnancy and what that means in terms of kind of training and the impact on pregnant women and also postpartum as well. So there's so many different parts of a female athlete's life cycle that just aren't really looked at. So to have a sweeping statement saying the female athlete is just that, it's a sweeping statement. And I think when you start looking into some of the implications around that generalized statement, previously it was just athletes and everything was working off essentially what was studied on men. And we'll talk a little bit about the kind of the accessibility around studies on female athletes. But that was kind of sweeping across, and that was just basically train as men do and hope it was all the same. But there started to be some changes around that, which is great. But still, if you then say, well, that's fine, that's all women, it really isn't. You're just looking at sort of people who are in that normal menstruation phase of their life, so not pregnant and not going towards a menopause, and they have now consolidated a menstrual cycle. You immediately have people who may have contraception, which will change things again. So there's lots of different changes between female athletes when they start at that pre-period, so prepubescent period, as they go through puberty and beyond. And then you start looking at some of the stats, and this is sort of jumping onto the back a little bit more of what Becky was talking around. The stats are really worrying, and I say that as a coach and someone involved in sport, and someone who wants to see people do better across any aspects of sport. But if you start looking at it, 43% of girls drop out of sport after primary school. And then 42% of women in any age is kind of not active enough for good health. Now, my guess is you guys have signed up for this talk because you've been involved within Castle Tri. So the chances are you probably don't fall into that category. But that means you fall into the category which are the people who should be inspiring those who could be doing more in terms of activity. And that would be the next generation of athletes as well. And then as you get older, it gets even more kind of concerning, if you like. So postpartum, so a lot of looking at elite athletes, and more elite athletes coming back. And again, we'll do a bit of a topic around postpartum and pregnancy for athletes. But the return to sport is directly linked to the sportiveness of their environment. That might be friends, that might be club mates, training buddies, teams, whatever that might be. But the return to sport is linked to the sportiveness, regardless if you're an elite athlete or if you're just someone who's starting to do their own park run, first park runs, and they're getting involved in sport. Your likelihood to return is based upon how supportive your network and your environment is around you. And as I said, as you get older, there's another third of those 60% of female athletes who are kind of there all the way through after the menopause. A third of those people then drop out again. So again, that's worrying. And 8 out of 10 women want to be more active but aren't, and they cite the menopause or menopausal symptoms as some of the main factors around that. So I think anything that we can do as a sport body, as people involved in the sport, to try and help identify the fact that female athletes are very varied and very different. And that will be a theme we talk about a few times through this presentation, but also recognize that there is actually, and this is an area that we do want to try and work on and change the tide completely, because if we can get more female athletes doing it, we doing more stuff, we inspire the next generation, and there's all the health benefits added onto that as well. So we're going to see a better, healthier, happier world as a result of that. So this presentation, I'm going to try and cover each of the different stages or significant stages around around the female athlete's life cycle, and just touch on some of the points that we have and where we're at with some of the science and how training can impact them as well. But before I do, I just want to kind of look a little bit into where this deficit is or the difference is or where that dropout is coming from. So based on the research at the moment, a lot of the dropout is coming from social pressures, not feeling safe. Unfortunately, there's a lot of high profile stories and news cycle where people are running. I think there's recently a nurse over in the States was killed when running. But there's a lot of conversations around that, which again I'll come on to a little bit later on. But social pressures, not feeling safe, feeling judged, awareness and self-consciousness of body image is something which is going to be around, and especially in a sport like triathlon. We spend a lot of time in lycra, and that's the most covered up we get to. You've got swimming as well on top of that, and wetsuits are notoriously great at showing everything as well. So body image is something which is going to be impacting a lot of athletes or people who potentially could be athletes wanting to get involved in the sport. We talked about the fact that menstruation is starting to be studied, and one of the things we're looking at with coaches of junior athletes is to have a kind of a court short bag and something which is really obvious and on the side. A lot of especially young girls will kind of use the menstrual cycle or having a period as a reason that they can't necessarily go and do training, go swimming or anything along those lines. And because the education around the coaching staff is, we don't really know what we do, that's someone dropping out of the sport one or two times, and they end up using that as potentially a reason for not doing more and a reason for embarrassment as well. And obviously, high profile, we looked at Wimbledon. This summer was the first time they allowed non-white wear for the female athletes there, so that if they were on the period, they could wear green shorts, which was, a long time coming, but it was a change that is worth highlighting there as well. There's a really interesting amount of studies around mismanagement of injuries, especially during the puberty years. So as a female, well, if you look at boys versus girls, boys essentially hit puberty, they get bigger, they get stronger, more testosterone, they get hairier, and they get smellier, and that sort of blokes that they don't really need much in terms of difference around the training other than load management. Whereas female athletes, girls, they go through puberty, and as they go through puberty, a lot of different things change. So the hips widen, and their coordination therefore changes, the center of mass changes. So their ability to do skill set things like tennis, catching, running, throwing, all these other basic PE-based skills, if you like, they actually are suddenly finding that really, really hard. So again, one of the reasons they feel judged, they then drop out of sport, they may pick up injuries as well. So for guys, a lot of the focus there is focus on getting stronger, moving faster, jumping higher, all those other great Olympic quotes. For female athletes, actually, the opposite is true. You want to go back into coordination and skill-based work, but that's often where people are starting to push. You start seeing trials for county, regional, national teams, etc., happen, and they want to do more, but actually their body's at a point where they need to be focusing less on doing more and more doing quality and relearning the quality, because they are essentially relearning how their body is moving. The social stigmas which go along with sport is definitely changing. And there's a really good positive movements out there around strong, not skinny, and some other great things as well. So those things are definitely changing, which is really positive to see. But still, there is a social stigma around just doing sport. And especially as an athlete gets older, they move later on through life, maybe have children, the kind of social stigma of doing sport versus doing things around family is also something which can and does exist as well. That increasing anxiety is something which kind of links in across quite a few of those other areas, and the self-confidence at those key change points in life. We're talking to one of our female coaches, and she put it a different way. She said, look, you go through being a kid and you're like, oh, this is great, being a kid's awesome. Then you hit puberty, you're like, whoa, what the hell was that going on? And then just in time you start working out what puberty is all about. You may or may not go through the contraception route, or you may or may not choose to have children. But whatever happens in that phase of life, you then kind of come out the other side of that again, there's a significant changes in your life, and suddenly you hit the perimenopausal phase and then the menopause, and you're like, well, I have no chance of actually keeping up with what's happening within my body. And then having the confidence and self-confidence around each of those change points is going to have a significant drop off as well. So she says, you're almost playing catch up the whole time with your body, and the time you start building that confidence in it, and self-efficacy is generally built through, for a lot of people, through doing something well and getting that feedback that it was done well. If you kind of think about that from a body perspective, and if you understand your body, you get a good response from it. It can be actually really challenging for female athletes to kind of work through that. So these are some of the causes of the deficit, and I'm going to sort of leave these there. I think it's important to kind of cover them off and think about them, especially if you start thinking, how can we be more of sort of role models to people who want to get more into the sport. And I'm going to just highlight the real obvious thing here. I'm a man. I'm not a female coach. So I'm not a female. I am a coach. I'm not a female athlete. And I think that's really important to highlight here, because a lot of the conversations I've had with athletes is often around the fact that they want to have a female coach coaching them, because they feel they can have some of these conversations. And actually, I think we're the only coaching company, one of the very few coaching companies which has an independent or separate pathway. So all our coaches go through what we call the endurance coaching pathway. And within that, we have a whole section on female physiology, and that's constantly being updated as more things get updated as well. And we're definitely one of the few coaching companies to have the pathway, and definitely there are a few coaching companies to also then have a section on female physiology. To put that into perspective, British Triathlon still doesn't have any sort of comment or difference between a male or a female athlete, which definitely needs to change. It isn't, but it should. And because of that, I think it's important to recognize that any coach should be able to have these conversations with you. And that's the standard we put ourselves to as Try Training Harder coaches, regardless of being male or female. The female can clearly bring to the table some of their own experiences, but that can often cause bias. I have no personal experiences of going through any of the changes that a female athlete may be going through in front of me. And so I've had to work through this one in terms of the science and working through actually what's going on. And that often makes me be more objective and less subjective about how things should or should not be. And this should work or should not work. And it means you kind of, I find quite often I'm having a conversation about trying to understand that female athlete's point of view. So at any point, if you feel that anything I'm saying doesn't quite resonate, or you want to have more information, please feel free to shout and challenge me, because I'm really happy to have that challenge. And that's the way I know I can get better, because each person will go through different points in life feeling differently. So don't be afraid about shouting about anything there at all. So if we go kind of back into I guess some practical advice around this, and this is kind of goes to show with how little I guess I know. I was, I think, a couple of years ago now, for International Women's Day, I decided I actually would ask my female athletes that I coach, and I do have quite a few female athletes for various or whatever reasons, and I've had some really good success with female athletes as well, especially over the long distance. And I just said to them, look, if you had to go and speak to somebody who was relatively new to the sport, what would be the advice that you would give them, especially around being a female athlete? So there was all sorts of interesting conversations which came out from going to the toilet, which clearly for guys, it's much easier to pull to the side of the road and nip into the bushes and go for a pee and then carry on going on a ride. In some instances, guys won't even bother getting off the bike. Whereas for female athletes, there's a lot more which needs to be considered around that. And only now we're starting to see clothing which allows an easy way of getting out of your bib shorts without having to take off every single layer that you exist just to go for a quick pee. So, I learned about the subtle stand technique, which I had no idea about. Learning around, making sure that female athletes do actually think about planning the route. And that, again, one thing which we also see with our camps, for example, we make sure that we do have toilet stops readily available for all the guides, and they know roughly where they are, so that we don't have a situation where a female athlete sat there waiting to go for a pee, really desperate, but not able to go, or not feeling that they can ask either. We just make sure there's a high frequency of cafe stops to facilitate that. And again, that's something which clubs can do really easily, but again, you can do as well if you're riding with other people. A lot of people find they end up holding on and waiting unnecessarily. So go early and don't wait. There's some conversations around what to do if you're racing and or training on your period. Again, thinking about planning your route, taking stops, taking extra sanitary pads or kit with you. And then one of the points which was made as well was your bib shorts, if you're on a bike, have a really big pad on them. So even if you are concerned about if you are running out, you've got a big pad there to use as well if you needed to. Again, these are things which I would never know as a male coach, but definitely I think a lot of female athletes new to sport might start wearing or thinking over the top off than they necessarily need to. There's a big conversation around sports bras. I think it's 80% of female athletes are not wearing the correct fitting sports bra, and that's sort of highlighted by all the female athletes I was working with. They were saying every single time go for something which is supportive and works for you, rather than just for the one which looks really good. But unfortunately, that's not often considered, and breast health is a big push for a lot of the kind of new courses around female athlete development as well. So again, bear in mind that kind of 4 out of 5 people potentially on this call are not wearing the right sports bra for them, and there are impacts that you can have around that which can be avoided and make your enjoyment of sport much better. And if you make the enjoyment of sport much better, again, look back at that graph or the graphic we had earlier around all those dropout points. If you've got the right kit and you're enjoying it, it's not sore, you're probably going to be staying in the sport for longer as well. We'll talk a little bit about the menstrual cycle a bit later, but again, there's some advice around what to do when tracking what you're looking for you. And then there was, as I mentioned earlier, that feeling safe bit was a real eye-opener to me, because I've never, up until this kind of conversation with athletes, I never really thought about that as a thing. So I used to sort of set, maybe a 30-minute commute ride for somebody. We talk about it, so this is an easy way of collecting extra miles. You need to go anyway to work, so why don't you run, or why don't you cycle to work and take advantage of that hour, if you like. It was half an hour. But I hadn't really considered with some of the athletes how much stress that was causing them, because of the fact they were worried about the route they were taking, especially in the winter months. So there's some really good advice around that. A lot of the stuff you might think is quite common sense, and other stuff is kind of useful. I've put the QR code there, and I've also added some links at the end of this presentation, just so you can go and have a look at it. But as I said, that was just a whole bunch of random advice around what would you give advice to a new athlete coming into the endurance sport, and trying to help sort of bring down some of those barriers. And I learned a lot as a coach, and I've been coaching at the time for well over a decade or two. Actually, a decade and a bit by that point. All around these other things that are going on around these people's working with and helping train, and I wasn't even thinking was a thing or a problem. So yeah, go have a look at that if you'd like to. The kind of the important thing though, that I want to kind of highlight as we go through all of this, is that research on female athletes is very, very, very limited, and it's also very low quality. So at the moment, a lot of what we see within the research and the science is this is being shown, this is being seen, this may be a correlation. There's no definitive yes or no. There's no black or white around how anything should do or be done. And some people are definitely pioneering a lot of some really, really good work in sort of key areas around female physiology. But there isn't necessarily the science to back it up and say this is true for everybody. So it just gives us a bit of a flavor of what could come. Essentially, the whole of sports science was done on probably guys between the ages of about 18 and 25, because those are the people at university who sign up to go and do a whole bunch of random time trial tests and be prodded and stabbed, and muscle biopsies done, and all the rest of the good stuff which you do at sports science school. So that was all done on that level of male athletes, usually sporty as well, not for the whole population of men, and certainly not for the whole female population either, which we saw earlier. There's a whole range of different female athletes, if you're going to call them that. On top of that, because of the menstrual cycle, let's just say it's 4 weeks, you actually need to kind of take 4 times the number of female athletes to get a more accurate number or indication of what someone at that point in their cycle, various points of the cycle, is going to be kind of actually experiencing when you look at the study. So there's a lot of work which needs to go back into sports science as we know it. So there are athlete performance factors which are true for everyone. Ultimately, if you can't ride a bicycle, that's probably going to be a limiting factor to you being able to go around a bike course really fast, compared to the female athlete performance factors. And it's often a question around what is the higher priority thing. But there are female physiological factors or performance factors which can come into it, which are definitely worth considering and looking into. And we mentioned sports bra earlier. That's something which will make a significant difference to your comfort and enjoyment of your racing and your training. So that's something which you should definitely look at trying to make sure is working for you. There are other considerations as well. I think the pelvic floor conversation is starting to gain a little bit more momentum now. A lot of people think about that more around postpartum work, but actually there was a study, and I can't remember the exact stats, but a very high percentage of female high performers, so people in the World Championship, Olympic level sport, the thing they were most worried about when they were going into competition wasn't whether or not they were going to do the best race of their lives at the key point, at the key time, in the key part of the race calendar. It was more about whether or not they would see themselves in front of an arena, but full of a whole bunch of other people. And so these are the sort of things which should not be happening in sport, but they do, and it's very, very common. And the minute coaches start having these conversations, we can actually start addressing it. But also, if more people, female athletes, can start talking about it and working on it as well, it's an area that can be done. So pelvic floor health is really important. 1 in 3 women suffer urinary leakages, which is significant. And it's a question, first of all, about allowing that to be a conversation, and also then facilitating change and facilitating opportunities that, again, people can go for a pee when they're on the bike without having to worry about it and holding on or anything along those lines. Again, same sort of thing with running. The menstrual cycle, does have an impact on female athletes for a whole host of different reasons. And as I said earlier, the research is very low quality. So there's no, this is definitely how to deal with the menstrual cycle. This will change this. This will cure this. Everyone is going to be very, very different. And so how they are impacted and how their performance changes between different individuals. So it also changes throughout the life of the athlete as well. It might be that the symptoms of a period are significant, and that means that the athlete needs to take a rest day or rest days or easier days around that. Or it might be, can you fine tune the hormonal impact on the athlete? And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, to facilitate maybe better chances or adaptions, or potentially how do you limit or reduce injury likelihood. So there was a really good change by Chelsea's women's football team. They identified that there was a significant increase in ACL injuries based on the type of pitch that their female athletes were training on, and also it couldn't really be controlled based on the time of all the different athletes at the different point in their menstrual cycle. It was usually happening when they were in the high hormone phase. So instead of trying to organize that for the whole thing, they just put their female team on the top of the state-of-the-art kind of top level, softer training pitch, and they prioritized them as opposed to the men's team, because that reduced the number of injuries that they were having and meant the performance was better. And that's obviously a fantastic example of how, once you start looking at what can happen and maybe happening, you can start making changes to keep athletes in the sport being consistent, because consistency has a bigger difference on performance than most other factors. Think about the equipment as well. So again, a lot of stuff is designed with men in mind. So they kind of take something and shrink it and pink it, is the old expression. But actually looking into sport specific equipment, which is for women, most women will find that their first items were probably men orientated. So it might be an old bike, wouldn't necessarily be female specific. There might be some more thoughts around some of the female specific stuff, and there's some great clothing lines out there now as well. But if you have something which isn't female specific and it's not comfortable, then they're probably going to drop out of the sport or not enjoy the sport as much. So there's a lot of work there which can be improved. And again, that's a performance change which could happen. It might be having the right size bike, or thinking about the size of the really common one is the handlebars. So if you've got a handlebar which is where the reach is between your where your thumbs go and then your fingers, that's going to impact how well you can brake the bike. If you can brake the bike better, you're going to feel more confident on the bike, going down fast on descents or braking and controlling. You're going to have a better experience. You'll enjoy cycling more, but you'll also be able to ride faster. Your results will be better as well. So it's little things like that which can make a really big difference to a female athlete. And the other one, which we'll talk about in a big way, is the additional nutritional requirements for female athletes, which is a huge opportunity for a lot of female athletes, and one which, as I said, we'll go into a bit more detail later on. The key thing from me as a coach is I'm coaching the individual, male or female, but female has a few other layers of some really interesting stuff which we can address to make some performance differences as well, which men don't have. But it is about coaching the individual because it's not going to be the same for each person. I remember having one athlete who kind of working through some work, and they were tracking their menstrual cycle, and the app was telling them this is how you should feel, and because of this point in the cycle you were, and it was exactly the opposite. So what the app was telling her that she should be feeling based on where she was totally the other way around. So it is about coaching the individual, not the process, or not the sort of the science at this point in time. If there's any questions, drop them in the chat, or feel free just to jump in. I'm very happy to at any time as well. So if we look a little bit at the hormonal changes, this is broadly what happens through the menstrual cycle. So you have the period, menstrual shedding phase, then there's a lower amount of hormones, and then you have a significant rise of progesterone and estrogen. And this is what we're talking about. Are there performance opportunities and things that we should be thinking about as coaches to improve performance? And the general science out there is, some people say yes, absolutely. Some people say there's not really enough to kind of say and have any real conclusive evidence. But pretty much everyone talks around the fact that knowing where you are within your cycle is really, really helpful. So it can be a really helpful way of indicating if there's anything else going on around stress on your body as well. So some of the things that can therefore take place based on some of those hormone changes will mainly be focusing around estrogen and progesterone. Those are the kind of the two big changes around the menstrual cycle, and can or may make some of the bigger changes. So with this slide here, I put a lot of information up there deliberately because there is a lot of information which is out there. Take it all with that pinch of salt. If it doesn't make a difference to you, it doesn't make a difference to you, and that's okay. We might find some more information out over the next few years, and more research is being done. But there might be some things there which we can address and look at. So estrogen is a big player of this in this side of things. The big things that it kind of impacts is around nutrition, really. So as you have an increase in estrogen, you're going to find it a bit harder to utilize carbohydrates from your body. So you're going to have to try and make sure you're eating more carbohydrates to kind of fuel the sport that you're doing. You're going to struggle to absorb protein as well. So you need to have more protein at these points in time, in particular leucine, which is one of the main building blocks for muscle, is going to be reduced. And you're also going to find you're going to do a bit more fat burning at this point in time as well. There can also be, as it says there, increases in fatigue and lethargy. There's some really good studies as well around coordination skills. And so, I mean, I've got an athlete who she generally gets less coordinated, and she'll find that she'll trip over a little bit more easily. She'll have stumbles or falls if she's on runs. So we move her running from predominantly on really slippery trails to slightly more road-based stuff where she's got a little bit more control in the environment, because we know that in a high hormone phase, she's slightly more clumsy, essentially. And that's sort of where that study was looking into the female footballers for Chelsea as well. So it's also there can be a little bit more clumsiness around that higher estrogen phase, to the extent that when she falls over, we can use that almost as a tracker of where she is in her menstrual cycle. Progesterone is the other big one, and a lot of this stuff again plays in around food and fuel. So it reduces your ability to store glycogen and access that glycogen again. So again, a double reason as to why you make sure you've got carbohydrate present whenever you can do. And it may increase the amount of sodium that you're sweating out. So you think about maybe having a little bit more salt in your diet. And you will find as well there's a bit more fluid retention. So again, making sure you're drinking enough throughout the day as well there. There are some other things which people see as well around increase in core body temperature, which that plus the sodium excretion and holding on to the water means you're going to find hot being a little bit warmer. So indoor sessions become that little bit harder. That point around protein use means you do need to think about eating a bit more. And as you move into just towards that point where you go into your periods, you're going to find that there's going to be an increase in metabolic rate because your body's doing more work. It's shedding the uterine lining. So you're going to need to eat a little bit more food that might be just 5-10% more more calories, sorry, at that point in time, just to allow from that based on your basic metabolic rate. Again, these little things, as we'll come into a bit more detail when we look into the food side of things, can make a big difference to how successful you are in the season in terms of consistency. So we talked about before, the kind of the main study kind of outcome is track your menstrual cycle because you know where you are, and you can start maybe seeing if any of these symptoms or things that happen are things that you can recognize and identify. Some people do, some people don't, and that's okay. It doesn't really matter. But have a look and see if you know where you are, you can keep an eye on it. And you can make some adjustments as you go. So things to think about in the high hormone phase, it might be around reducing that intensity and increasing the hydration because of the fact that you can't get access to as much carbohydrate. You're going to find things a little bit hotter, and you're going to find that it's just harder to maybe hit some of those higher intensities and then recover from it with the protein as well. So when you're that high hormone phase, think about the fueling that you're trying to do, make sure you're recovering afterwards properly, think about more fluids. And there's some suggestions there around supplementation as well, which may cause some may help as well around going in towards some menstrual cramping, in particular magnesium, and some other thoughts around that as well, which has been shown to kind of reduce some of the symptoms and side effects. In the low hormone phase, so a common question that gets asked is, I'm really worried because I'm going to go on my race and I'm going to be on my period. Well, actually, because of the fact that your hormone levels are quite low, you are in a good place to race at that point in time. That doesn't mean that you are in a bad place to race at the other when you're in a high estrogen or high hormone phase. It's just that you have to adapt things a little bit. But the low hormone phase, as long as the symptoms of the menstruation or your period aren't actually causing you any issues, actually could be a really successful point in time for athletes to look into sort of really going hard and seeing what they can do. And iron, something which for a lot of female athletes is worth supplementing. Obviously, you want to get that kind of confirmed by a nutritionist, but it might be something you look at doing a little bit more as you go into your period as well. So as I said, there's a lot of stuff on that slide quite deliberately because there is sort of lots of information out there which is starting to be interesting. But these are some of the key takeaways. So if there's any questions around that, feel free to fire away. So the other side of things, the other question is the impact of contraception. And there's a lot of different types of contraceptions out there. And as a coach, I'm definitely not someone who sort of sit there going, right, okay, let me know about exactly the contraception type and everything that you're on. It's only really a conversation which happens when it becomes something which may impact an athlete, or they start asking the question specifically around around contraception. Menstruation, though, on the other hand, is something that clearly I want to know that the athlete is menstruating normally, because that's a sign of good health, good endocrine function. With contraceptions, there was a bit of a study in New Zealand that potentially there could be performance impacts by having certain types of contraception or not taking contraception, because you can start training more with your menstrual cycle. That may or may not be the case. I'm not too sure that impacts for most female athletes that we're looking at the age group level. So I think do what you want from that side of things. It does, what you take will impact your hormones slightly, so you may or may not see some of those symptoms. The key thing around this, though, is still make sure you're comfortable about where you are within your menstrual cycle, because that is the bit which is motivating potentially a lot of the changes, the symptoms that we might see, or we'd be wanting to see that consistency around menstruation as well. So what you can, if you're on contraception, especially if you're on something which you have a withdrawal bleed rather than an actual menstruating bleed, try and look for other signs of where you are within your menstrual cycle, so you can then track and see if there are any cyclical patterns that you can pick up on, and then you can adjust and allow for in your own training plan, or work through with a coach as well. The other big change is motherhood, and I think the big change for motherhood is less around the physiological changes, although they are significant. It's actually what happens afterwards in terms of your time, which gets eaten into significantly, in that kind of classic mother's guilt as well. So I think a lot of marketing for especially coaching, but a lot of triathlon stuff talks about the time crunched athlete, and I think if you're a mother, you're probably the most time crunched athlete that there is out there. There's a study which you're looking at sort of 14 hours a day thinking about being a mother on top of your normal job, and if you're a triathlete or endurance athlete trying to put in endurance training on top of that as well. It's really, really hard. So if we look at the pregnancy side of things, there's really very little research out there, partly because it's not that ethical to do research on a pregnant woman whilst they're going through pregnancy to work out what they're doing because of the impact if they're doing that study and it's not quite as good as it should be. So a lot of the stuff out there is based upon the fact that if you're doing over 7 hours of training, then your class is an elite athlete. Up to 7 hours of training, there's some very significant limits around how much training you can do, what heart rate you can get up to, and a few other things like that. For a lot of female athletes, if they're relatively serious about their sport, let's just say they're doing 1 training session a day, sorry, they're going to be pretty close to that 7 hours already. You know, a 2 hour bike ride at the weekend and a few training sessions through the week, you're going to be pretty close to that 7 hour mark. So you kind of get classed as an elite athlete, even though you may not see yourself as an elite athlete straight away. But what that does mean is it does open the door to working towards heart rate. So if you had power, if you had pace, if you had any of those sort of things, heart rate's definitely going to be your friend because heart rate is your physiological impact on your body. So you'll see an elevated heart rate naturally, especially through that. Well, you will do naturally anyway, but you'll see that through the first trimester and second trimester. It'll kind of drop off maybe a little bit where you get more blood in your system, but you'll see a higher heart rate just generally happening, and you can use that as your way of just measuring how hard you're working. With all female athletes who are pregnant, it goes without saying, just do what you feel is right. And I think that dialing into your own body is going to be absolutely key. So if you feel like you want to go for a really hard, high intensive run, then that's fine. You can go for that. But if you have that in the training program and you don't feel that that's the right thing to do, then you should be absolutely saying, that's not what I'm going to go away and do. There's some stuff which you really can't do around sort of super heavy weightlifting where you're kind of breathing significantly out just to get the weight up, and some other things around positions you're doing, especially as you start having that separation between your abdominals going on, that you need to manage really carefully. And there's some really good advice out there around what you can and can't do. Some sort of Pilates classes, pregnancy-based Pilates is fantastic. There's still a lot that you can do, and if they're really good professionals around that, they'll actually be looking into conversations with you which are more focused around what can you do rather than here's a big list of things that you can't do at all. So we were looking potentially at trying to help that female athlete. Well, let's try and see what you can do. How can we keep you doing what you have been doing all the time, and how can we kind of keep that going for as long as you want it to be going through as well? So there's no way of doing it. And I think we talk about social media as well in the postpartum phase, but there's a lot of stuff out there about this. You know, I was running until I was 38 weeks pregnant and I was doing this, and other people can't do it. Each pregnancy, even for the same woman, is going to be different. So there's no hard fast rule about what you can and can't do. The stuff what I would say is that there's some really great studies around and this is one to sort of throw at people, especially if they kind of start to say, you know, you can't do it because you're pregnant, you know, you've got to be careful, is actually the fitter the mother through pregnancy, the less obese is probably the unfair way of putting it. The leaner, the healthier from a body fat percentage way the child was afterwards as well when you looked at them about 3-4 years old. So there's some really positive things about being active through pregnancy. You don't need to be sat there going and doing ultra marathons and, you know, Ironman distance races and all those other good stuff. You can remain doing what you were doing, and that's absolutely fine. But you can just need to back it off, and that heart rate's a really helpful way of keeping a track of that. As I said, there's not a huge amount of information around that, but just go on how you feel you kind of are, and bear in mind that as soon as you are postpartum, you now have to carry the thing in your arms, and so having strong shoulders, strong core, strong everything else is going to be helpful in those early phases as well. In fact, I've got one athlete who did particularly well in an Ironman distance swim, and they'd done like 1 swim a week, and it was mainly from carrying a toddler that made them particularly strong for the swim rather than anything else, genuinely. Postpartum training, there's a little bit more going on there around what you can and can't do. There's some really good advice out there, and there's some really old-fashioned advice as well. This is where I think a lot of the high-profile quick returns to sport are really skewing the perception of what you can do, what you ought to do, and what people are or should be capable of. And it kind of becomes what is the benchmark that you should be working towards rather than the abnormal. And the other side of it as well is that quite often there's a really good flash in the social media conversation around, hey, look at this athlete, isn't she fantastic? She's 6 weeks postpartum and she's just gone and won this race, or she's just gone and done this event, and it's fantastic. And it's not to take away from those achievements at all. It is fantastic, but the conversation isn't then picking up with the same intensity. What happened a few months later when they had two stress fractures and they weren't able to do something because they hadn't quite got that quite right, or they weren't able to continue. There was can't remember the female athlete, ultramarathon runner, who kind of was one of those stories, but then really pushed the conversation that she had because she had a significant prolapse afterwards a few months later, and it was all because she had done that and she continued thinking she was able to do things, but actually she wasn't recovered postpartum as well as she could have been, and so she wanted to really highlight that to other sort of athletic females to make sure they were ready to go back into sport. And she's fine now, but really working towards that women's health side of things. I had one of the best bits of advice, and I've seen it quite a few times with sort of female athletes, and there's been quite a few athletes I've been working with who have been pregnant and now postpartum, and this advice came from one of my friends rather than anyone who's in any way athletic, but they said, it takes 9 to 10 months to grow a baby, so it takes about 9 to 10 months to get back to where you were before you started growing the baby. And actually, that's a pretty good time scale. I'd say 9 to 10 months to a year afterwards is probably where you're going to start seeing physiologically you're back to where you were. More or less, obviously, depending on the individual. But the hormone changes can take up to 2 years to return back to normal. So you'll see significant changes, erratic periods, or inconsistent in irregular periods. You'll see kind of big changes and swings around that for up to 2 years postpartum. So your body is still recovering for quite a long time afterwards, and I think putting that into perspective can sometimes help people come back to the sport. Relaxing is a big, if you like, enemy is not quite fair, but the big kind of thing you have to overcome as a female athlete postpartum. Relaxin is there to make the ligaments and the joints of your body looser so that the pelvis can open up so you can give birth. And it hangs around for a while whilst you're breastfeeding as well afterwards. So whilst relaxin's in the system, you're going to find everything is a bit looser. Your joints, the ligaments, the tendons, they're not doing the job they are designed to do normally without the relaxin present. So they're going to be slightly more elastic, so a little bit looser, which means your muscles have to work a lot harder to stabilize. So a lot of the impact you then have around training injury management is actually about the fact that you're much less stable in the range of motion, which is now much greater as well. So when you look at injuries generally, without having a relaxant in the system, we're talking about how much control you have through a range of motion. And suddenly you've increased the range of motion and you've reduced the amount of control you have. So injuries are likely to happen. Also for running, it's going to be harder to run more effectively because you want that stiffness in your system to be able to run a bit faster or get elastic recoil energy as well. So relaxing can be something which is a difficulty to overcome. Some women don't really have as much of an issue with it. Other women have a significant issue with it. Again, everybody's different. So you do just need to bear in mind that whilst you are breastfeeding, if you choose to breastfeed, that will impact performance and will also mean that you may get a higher chance of injury. A women's health physio is something which I'd actually recommend for most female athletes to see, regardless of their postpartum. Go back to that point around the one out of 3 women have urine leakage, and they kind of normalized it, especially for older women who have had children as well. It's sort of a normal thing. I can't run because I'll wee myself, which isn't actually fair or true. So we can change the conversation there. But yeah, looking into women's health physio and really making sure that pelvic floor health is back up to where you want it to be will make a really big difference to your functional movement. It impacts how you control your pelvis, which impacts how you're able to move and control running, cycling, and swimming. The big factor, though, is the non sort of training stuff. So how much time you have, getting to the swimming pool becomes really hard amongst naps and breastfeeding time or feeding time, sorry. All those things make a big issue. Send the kids off to school, to nursery, they come back with 1,000 viruses. That's also going to wipe out your race calendar quite quickly as well. There's a lot to be said around kind of being able to offer flexible, Becky, one for you guys, flexible race entries for female athletes that they are postpartum, because it will make them more likely to get back in sport. They want to be there. It's just that life gets in the way, especially with young children. So anything there which we can help female athletes getting back into sport is great. But these are the things which are more likely going to impact your training routine more significantly than a lot of the other stuff we talked about, and allowing training or a training program which facilitates that time and has that flexibility is really important, and being really super organized yourselves to be able to kind of almost be ready to go, because it is a bit reactive quite often with a newborn or a young toddler. You're like, oh, actually they've just gone sleep now, I've got time to go and jump on, do 40 minutes on the bike, or I can go and do some Pilates or some strength work. So having some sort of flexibility and some sessions in the back pocket that you can use, and being able to change and adjust your training is going to be so important for that athlete at that point in time. The aging female athlete is a really interesting area, and as I said earlier, there's starting to be a little bit more conversation around the menopausal symptoms and how that can impact training. But if you think about this another way, we've only just started normalizing the conversation around periods and menstrual cycle, more so in sport, interestingly. If we've just had a few more conversations around the menopause, around the workplace, around general everyday life, you can understand how little kind of science and research is going into the female athlete of the same sort of age. So this is an area which is going to explode in terms of what we can learn from, and we can do better. But there are certain things which happen to the older athlete full stop. So we're going to see a decline in essentially their aerobic capacity VO2 max. That with that comes a reduction in maximum heart rate and how much blood can be thrown around or pumped around the body. Muscle mass is going to start reducing. It's going to be harder to sustain muscle mass, and you're also going to start seeing an increase in body fat. That happens to guys and as well as women as well. So that's going to be consistent no matter what. The bit which I find really fascinating is the perimenopause, which is the bit where you start seeing changes in your menstrual cycle. So you have a really regular menstrual cycle, hopefully, and then it changes. It starts being a little bit less regular. You start seeing some of the symptoms coming out. That can happen up to 9 years before the menopause actually begins. The menopause is 12 months, or the point after 12 months where you had no period at all. A lot of people talk about the menopause as a general kind of collection thing for perimenopausal, postmenopausal. But if you're being very specific, it's just the point in time after 12 months from your last period, and then you become postmenopausal. So the perimenopausal symptoms are when you start seeing a decline in estrogen, and we saw there how high estrogen can have impacts on the body, or the physiology may have impacts on it. A decline in estrogen has other impacts, and a lot of that's because estrogen is that kind of a sex hormone, but also that it's an equivalent, if you like, to testosterone. So it has a lot of work around muscle building and being able to sustain muscle mass as well. So when we start seeing that decline and change in hormone levels, we see additional changes to the aging athlete compared to just the male athlete equivalent, where you're seeing the three kind of big changes there. Some of the things which we're starting to see around the menopausal changes is around bone health, muscle tone, and also an increased level of cortisol, because of the fact that you've got more stuff going on in your body. Your body is under more stress. Cortisol, the stress hormone, you're going to start seeing that you've got higher stress levels within your body because there's change. That can also happen if you don't get much sleep. So it's the same sort of that response, that cortisol level. Cortisol has a few different things which are really good about, but also can impact athletes. It predominantly means there's going to be less of a buffer. We talk about buffers with athletes. So if you've got a big buffer, you can withstand a huge training load or stress, training load, life stress, whatever. If you're slightly thinner in the buffer, then you're going to have less of a time before you start feeling really bad or you start picking up injuries. And so that cortisol is going to reduce that buffer that a female athlete has, and it can also change or make a lot of the symptoms that we see. So reduction in muscle mass, increased body fat storage, go actually worse than what they were if you didn't have as much cortisol in there. Fuel is the most important thing. I'm going to talk about REDs, I think in the next slide or coming up. So I won't go into a huge amount of detail on that just now, but what I will say is that immediately what you start seeing with female athletes in particular, we start saying, oh, I'm starting to lose muscle. I had nutrition strategies work before, they don't now work at all. I need to eat less and I'll move more. And that's going to put someone into a state of REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. We'll talk about that in a second, but what you then start seeing is an increase in cortisol, an increase in fat storage, because your body goes into more of a fight or flight response. So that sort of response, but I'll just kind of eat a bit less because I'm clearly putting weight on because I'm gaining body fat, which is an aging process, becomes then kind of more of a bigger problem around that REDS conversation. So some of the stuff you want to look at to try and keep the muscle mass in there and keep that bone strength is to look into sort of higher intensity training and strength work. Strength work for older athletes, full stop, is really, really important, as is intensity training. So a lot of people kind of, to make the joke, you go longer distances as you get older. So you start off doing your sprint stuff and Olympic stuff as you're going Olympic hopeful, and then you kind of start going long distance, long, slow work as you move towards the older age groups. The actual reality is that if you can keep high intensity training sessions in there and strength work, you're going to make sure that you've got good bone strength, because the strength work is going to ask for more of a change adaptation within the body and the bone, and also the muscle, and therefore you're going to be able to store it a little bit more as well. Nutrition is going to be really important, and the main thing around that is an increased protein intake, sort of 2 to 3 times more than what the kind of classic allowance is. So if the recommended allowance is 20 to 40 grams of protein after exercise, you'll be looking at going towards that 40 to 60 gram mark, rather than sort of the lower level, because your body can't use the protein as well as much, and you also need more of it because your body's declining in the muscle and the bone density as well. This is where and you also want to make sure that you've got good carbohydrate availability. You can't create muscle if you're in a state of calorific deficit. So if you go down the route of not kind of giving your body enough because you see those body changes happening, then you're not be able to create more muscle, which means you can just then store fat and break the muscle down more and more. So it's kind of that big cyclical spiral downwards, which just exacerbates everything. So making sure you've got energy availability, making sure you've got fuel, and then making sure that you've got protein in there as well for afterwards is going to be so important as you move towards the older ages. And I think with all coaching, communication becomes absolutely key. But the reality is that there will be good days and there will be bad days. There'll be days where everything feels fantastic and you don't want to do a slow, boring, ride. You want to go and do something really hard and fast because you feel like you really can. Go for it. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And there'll be days where you just can't do the training session set because of all sorts of symptoms going on. The classic symptoms, which we hear about, and when people associate more with menopause, your hot flushes, etc. All those things still exist as well. So it's not about ignoring them. It's about recognizing that they're there and having that conversation with your coach or your training people, and adapting your training as you see fit, but trying to stay within those principles around a bit more intensity and a bit more, and making sure you're fueling yourself as well. It's just very, very changeable, and we have to be able to be comfortable reacting to that, both athlete and also training program or coach. So I said I'd talk about REDS, and for me, this is a really important area generally for athletes. But I think it's it's more important when you have a conversation with endurance athletes, and even more important when you start having a conversation with female athletes, and even more important when you start talking about aging female athletes as well. So REDS is hands down one of the most important areas which we want to look at. So REDS, as I mentioned earlier, is the relative energy deficiency in sport. So that's that you don't have as much energy you need for your sport itself. A lot of people may have formerly known it as the female athlete triad or triad. And that's where you're looking at bone health, lack of menstruation for female athletes. There's something else in there as well, but it's gone from me off the top of my head at the moment. So that ability to track your menstrual cycle, if you didn't have a menstrual cycle, that was a kind of deemed as one of the things which put you in that female athlete triad. Quite often you see people with stress fractures as well, but this is identifying it as something which is true for both sexes, not just female athletes. And the key thing to recognize with REDS is that there are changes across more than just menstruation and bone density. Is looking into a whole host of other things like immunity. So you might be picking up loads of illnesses, physiological, psychological health as well. I think some really good crossover between the symptoms you have with an athlete or with anyone with RED-S, and then the symptoms you have with someone with some mental health things, say like depression. I'm not saying necessarily the two are totally linked up, but there are the impacts which exacerbate certain areas as well. So there's a big crossover. The IOC, International Olympic Committee, put in RED-S as the new definition about 10 years ago now, and last year it updated the kind of the risks and the risk factors associated with RED-S, and basically looked at endurance sports as the main trigger. I put an article together a few years ago now around energy availability and highlighting the point around RED-S. And there was some really interesting research there which talked about how, I think it was collegiate level, so high performance collegiate level athletes were in a state of low energy availability or RED-S, or going towards RED-S, and they weren't doing it deliberately. They had no idea. It's just they were doing a lot of training, and they just weren't managing that in terms of the training load and nutrition load as well. So what are we talking about exactly? So energy or RED-S is at a point is a clinical terminology, but we're looking more importantly at energy availability. So energy availability is a bit like a mobile phone, where energy availability is the leftover energy that you have to do your bodily functions. So if you have a mobile phone, as an example, if you have 50% battery left and you then say, I'm going to take a phone call, you're going to take the phone call. It's still going to do all the fun stuff which it does, and our phones do a lot of stuff in the background that we don't know about it. If you put it into low battery mode, you can still take the phone call, but it's now not doing all the stuff that it was doing in the background as well. And when you start looking at energy availability is the amount of energy left over once you put in all the stuff that you can consciously do. So if you put some numbers onto that, let's just say an athlete takes on board 2,500 calories. They go and do a really big bike ride. So 100 miles or so, they burn maybe 5,000 or 6,000 calories. They then only have 2,000 or 1,900 calories left over for everyday life. That's how it goes. If you go and have 1,500, which is a kind of classic number quoted for female athletes, and you still go and do that big bike ride, and you burn 5,000 calories, you now only have 1,000 calories left to do your everyday life stuff. And that's where this conversation becomes really interesting, because your body needs to have what it needs to have in order to be healthy. So energy availability, as the equation there, is your calorie intake less the energy, the exercise expenditure. So in that instance, the bike ride, divided by your fat-free mass. So putting numbers on it, you're looking at about 45 to 50 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass. So if you take a 60 kilogram athlete and just assume that they're 25% body fat, which is moderately healthy for a female, that means they've got 45 kilograms of fat-free mass for bones and muscles and other tissues going on as well. So you're looking at about 2,000-ish, 2,100, 200 calories that they need to have, plus anything which they're doing exercise related, just to make sure that they're hitting that 45 to 50 kilocalories per kilogram of body mass. It changes with your body fat percentage, and I know you can't necessarily measure that really accurately. Some scales say they do, some scales don't, but you can kind of make a bit of a guess with that. And I when I'm having this conversation with athletes, I say, look, you're probably not 5% body fat because you'd be very ill, and you're probably not 60% body fat, you're going to be really ill. Shove those two really big numbers into the kind of equation and see where that puts you. And the amount of calories that they need to eat is often significantly higher than what they may have realized it was beforehand. It's very different to that energy in versus energy out, because it allows the makeup of the athlete. So for athletes, it's a much more useful number to look at. We talk about 45 to 50 kilocalories being important. So that's how many you've got left over. And you need that to be able to do all your normal everyday life stuff. So coughing, sneezing, breathing, heart rate going off in the background, being some obvious stuff, but some of the less obvious stuff would be endocrine function, so hormone function, making sure your bones are all nice and healthy, brain health, all kind of anything else around cellular function going on in your body, which you can't necessarily control. If your body starts dipping below that 45, 50 kilocalories per kilogram of body fat, per kilogram of fat-free mass, sorry, your body starts turning things off. So it starts saying, well, we haven't got enough energy to do all these things. We're going to keep the heart going because we need that. We're going to keep the brain going, the lungs going. So we'll turn off this thing. We'll turn off this thing. And as you reduce that, more things get turned off. Female athletes go into what's known as low energy availability when they get below 30 kilocalories of kilogram of body fat. Men, it's for below 25. So that sounds quite low, and it's quite a big jump, but actually it's quite easy to do if you're training quite hard. After about 5 days, you see a loss of or reduction in endocrine function if you're in that state of LEA for a prolonged period of time. And over time, you start seeing into relative energy deficiency in sport. This can be some of the biggest issues around for endurance athletes, but definitely female athletes, because you need to be really, really close to that 45, 50 kilocalories. Otherwise, you can start seeing changes which you can't necessarily identify, because you'll still be able to go for a run. And that's the most common conversation we have. So I don't need to eat any more food because I can still run. Go back to the phone. You can still make that phone call, but you've then just eaten more into that available energy, which you can then use for training or for body functions as well. So making sure that you're eating enough is really, really key. And if we go back to some of the points around the menstrual cycle, around menopause, sorry, that becomes even more key, because a lot of those symptoms we're talking about, of the increased fat, body fat around a loss of muscles, that's also linked into low energy availability. So the first thing you want to try and do is make sure that you don't have low energy availability. You're eating enough. You're not in a red state, because all those symptoms are the same. So if we know that that's now in a situation where you're eating enough to do your sport and to be healthy, health comes before fitness, then we then know that the symptoms we're seeing are actually going to be to do with, say, menopause or something else as well, which you can then start exploring in a bit more detail. Up until that point, you're just making kind of a guess, really, in terms of what's going on in your body, and you're not really too sure about how that can impact it. So often, as it says there, people start looking into other solutions because they think there's other things going on without identifying the simple question, which is, are you actually fueling your sport and your health? And if you're not doing that, then it doesn't matter how many different suggestions or fads or ideas you're having. Quantity before quality, and then you can worry about the rest. So to kind of summarize a lot of what we're talking about for female athletes in general, as it says there, everyone is really, really different. So you need to know your own body, and that kind of circle at the top there, knowing your body is true for training. It's about nutrition, but make sure those two things are right. So balance the nutrition with the training, balance the training with nutrition. Your training plan should, even if you're not working with a nutritionist, but working yourself, your training plan should have nutrition integrated throughout it. So you need to make sure you've got the carbohydrate available for the session. You've got to make sure that you've got the protein for afterwards, and you're making sure that side of the training and the nutrition is really, really dialed in. Because if you don't quite get that right, you could have other issues going on later on. And also, you want to make sure you know your own individual physiology. So your changes through menstruation, through the menopause, really learn what works for you. If you don't, it's going to be very difficult to apply the science, because it's too loose at the moment. There is science going on there, and it's really improving, which is great, but it's not kind of, this is the best way of doing anything yet. And I don't think we'll ever get to that point. So knowing how your body works is going to be really, really important. If you've got a coach, then work with them as opposed to hiding anything from them. So we talked about the menopause and that communication piece, but it's true across all stages of that female athlete's life. Really communicate that with the coach, because they can help adjust the training and still empower you to do really well, but also you can then start recognizing how you're moving forwards. And then kind of mentioned it there again, but it's so important, is really make sure that your nutrition and your training and your physiology are interlinked into any training program. If you're not, you're not looking at yourself as a whole. So if you just focus on the training, not the nutrition, you're not actually improving completely. So make sure you do have all those things lined up together. I don't know if those QR codes will work, but I do have the links there if you want to have a look at it. A few kind of good things. We've got a female athlete advice section. Sorry, we've got that as a practical advice article I mentioned at the beginning, which if you've got a friend who's kind of getting into sport and you want to say, hey, look, here's a list of things you need to think about. There's some just really practical, basic things to consider. If you've got some male coaches or anything in there, then show them that, because as I said, I learned a huge amount just from my athletes, and what I felt was a normal session was actually a really big deal for them. Dr. Stacey Sims is a really good pioneer around both the menopause and general female physiology. She tends to say everything as this is the way it is, and a few other sort of a bit of the other science starts sort of questioning how factual, as in not factual, but how that is the way. It's sort of like, well, actually, that is showing promise, but it's not necessary yet. But I think she's definitely leading the way in a lot of the research going on, and is worth having a read about what she's looking at. The conversation we just had around energy availability is on that third link down there, and we have on the Try Training Harder website, we've got a topic for all different sections, so be that running or cycling or swimming, but also one on female athletes. So you can go and read all the articles that we've collated around the female athlete, specifically postpartum training and perimenopausal training. We put some stuff up there for you as well. And there's some really good research from the Women in the Sport and the Whale HQ, which is worth going and having a look at and read at, around menopause, around pelvic health, around a whole host of other areas, and some really great work which they're doing around getting and inspiring younger female athletes in the sport as well. So definitely have a look around those two areas too. And that leaves me with any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. That was, yeah, really, really interesting. I think we've all probably learned something here today. And yeah, I think it's just the main takeaway is just to really, I guess, know yourself, and any impacts, like as women, obviously everything that we go through does impact training and therefore does impact, your competition. And yeah, it's really great to hear that you're working so closely as well as a coach with everyone from Try Training Harder, just to yeah, be there for. We've got a question here from Alicia. Oh, well, there you go, Philip. She just really enjoyed your talk and said it was really informative, so yeah, thank you.
Stunned into silence.
I know. Yeah.
Cool. Well, my contact details were on the last slide, and we are sending a recording out. So if there are further questions, then feel free to drop an email. I'm really happy to continue the conversation. It's an important one to be having,
Yeah.
and recognize that as female athletes, you are people who are driving and inspiring both the next generation, but also your peer groups as well. So the more we can do that, the better.